My name is Grace Whitlow. I served as a military field nurse for over 2 decades, on dusty bases under enemy fire in makeshift tents with more blood than bandages. I earned a Bronze Star in Kandahar and carried more pain than I ever had time to process. But to my son, I'm just a tired old woman with a pill organizer and a fading memory. You're just an old nurse, Mom. He didn't even say it with anger, just low enough that the other people in the waiting room wouldn't hear but loud enough to cut. His eyes didn't lift from his phone, thumb still scrolling like I was background noise he was tolerating. We were sitting in the children's ER wing waiting for the nurse to call his son's name. My grandson, Lucas. The boy had been running a high fever all night, and Claire, his wife, was out of town visiting her sister. So Ethan called me. Not because he wanted to, because he had no one else. When I first arrived at their door that morning, he barely looked at me, just handed me the diaper bag and said, "You remember how to buckle the car seat, right?" I didn't respond. I simply did what I always did. Stepped in, where needed, invisible and useful. At the hospital, Lucas lay limp against Ethan's chest. I could see the poor thing was dehydrated, cheeks, flushed lips dry. I leaned in gently and whispered, "He needs fluids soon or he's going to spike again." That's when he said it. "You're just an old nurse, Mom. Let the professionals do their job." It was the way he emphasized just that did it. Like my years meant nothing. Like I'd been dusting shelves, not holding people's organs together in tents lit by emergency lanterns. I didn't respond right away. I sat back folding my hands in my lap. My fingers. Stiff from arthritis now. Still remembered what it felt like to clamp an artery. Still remembered the gentle precision of stitching skin while the ground rumbled from distant blasts. Those hands had seen more death than Ethan would ever understand. And now they trembled ever so slightly, not from age but from restraint. But this wasn't new. Ethan had been brushing me aside for years. The older he got, the more I faded from view. It started subtly, a missed birthday call, a joke about my landline era. Then came the moments that stayed with me longer than they should have. Claire rolling her eyes when I brought soup over uninvited Ethan, telling me not to worry so much. "This isn't war, Mom." He used to say it with a chuckle like it was charming, but underneath I heard it clearly. "You're irrelevant now. They think I overreact, that I read too much into things." And maybe I do, but I also spent 17 years reading the temperature of a battlefield from one breath, one blink, one twitch of a medic's fingers. You don't unlearn that. You just learn to keep it to yourself. What they know, I worked in the Army as a nurse. What they don't know, I was a major in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. I commanded a rapid response unit that deployed ahead of formal clearance. We set up emergency triage stations in caves under bridges and once in the shell of a school that still had crayons scattered across the floor. I made life and death decisions under blackout conditions, rationed morphine like currency, and once saved a young lieutenant by stitching his liver closed with less than 5 minutes to spare, while being fired upon. They don't know because I never told them. Ethan was still young when I left the military. He was 10 when I came home for good. By then, the insomnia had become part of me. So had the quiet. I'd tell him stories about my hospital friends and Army friends, carefully editing out the flashbacks that still came when I heard metal crash against metal. When he brought home fireworks, one 4th of July, I spent the whole night in the bathtub, arms around my knees, willing the shaking to stop. He never asked. So I never explained. The silence became our language. Claire once asked me why I didn't hang up my certificates or awards. I told her I didn't need to decorate the walls to know who I was. She smiled politely and turned back to her tea. She never asked again. Some truths are like landmines. You don't touch them unless you're ready for what might happen. And the truth is, I carry a chest in the back of my closet that holds the folded flag they gave me when Private Aldridge bled out in my arms. I keep a crumpled photo of my unit, all of us standing half-exhausted in muddy boots, grinning like fools because we made it out that day. But Ethan has never seen that photo. He's never asked what I kept from those years, or why I sometimes cry when the national anthem plays on TV. Instead, today he glanced over at me in that plastic ER chair and said those words like flicking lint off his sleeve. "You're just an old nurse. And maybe I am. Or maybe I'm more than that. But I got tired of explaining. Because to explain would mean remembering. Not just the medals or the orders or the briefings, but the screams, the heat, the sand that got into every pore of your skin, even under the bandages. The way a soldier's eyes go distant when they realize they won't make it home. I chose quiet because quiet was safe. I chose silence because it kept me sane. And somewhere along the way, silence turned into invisibility. Ethan checked his phone again, sighing loud enough for the couple across from us to glance up. "I just wish they'd call already," he muttered. "This is taking forever." I nodded. "I know, honey. Because I've waited before. Waited in bomb shelters under camouflage nets beside broken bodies and broken radios with nothing but intuition and adrenaline keeping someone alive. But here in this air-conditioned room with soft music playing from the ceiling and the smell of antiseptic instead of ash. I was just his mother, just a nurse, and I let them believe that, because remembering anything else meant remembering too much. Before the silence there was fire. Not literal always, but pressure, movement, decisions that split seconds in half. Back then, my voice didn't tremble. When I gave an order, it carried across wind, sand, blood, and doubt. I was Major Grace Whitlow, Combat Medic Field Commander Trauma Unit Leader, and I knew how to keep people alive. But nothing trains you for the weight of disobedience. It happened during Operation River Shield. I remember the briefing room more than the battlefield that day. The walls were beige, warped from humidity. A fan whirred overhead blades, dusty from years of ignoring. Intelligence had come in about enemy movement in a sector that had been quiet for weeks. Too quiet. That's always what they said when they wanted justification. Too quiet. The coordinates were marked in red ink. "Strike approved," the colonel said. "No boots on the ground. Just clearance and confirmation." I asked if they'd verified civilian absence. He waved it off. "Intel says minimal collateral risk. Just do your part, Major." But I couldn't. The night before, I'd treated a woman with second-degree burns. Her son had tried to cook over a fuel drum. She said their family and others had relocated to that sector because the old one had been bombed out. She didn't know the names of the villages, just followed where others fled. I saw fear in her eyes, the kind that doesn't lie. That kind stays with you. So I hesitated. I called in a field check, requested drone visuals. It delayed the operation by 90 minutes. 90 minutes of being questioned, pressured, asked if I'd lost my edge. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "We're not pulling that trigger blind." When the feed came through, it showed what I feared: civilians. Dozens. A makeshift refugee zone. Some children running after a soccer ball. Some huddled around open fires. A school building with a white flag painted across its rooftop. That 90-minute delay saved lives. No one said thank you. When we got back to base, the climate had changed. I wasn't reprimanded officially, but requests I used to get in minutes started taking hours. My assistant was reassigned without notice. Meetings were rescheduled but never rebooked. My command login to the medical dispatch system began returning errors. They didn't say I was wrong. They just made me disappear. And I let them. Because part of me was tired, not just physically. Though, yes, the 19-hour days and field tent beds took their toll. But soul tired. I felt the shift. The line between protecting lives and preserving appearances had thinned, and I had stepped off it. So I filed my resignation. Technically, it was a transition to voluntary retirement, but anyone who's served knows the language doesn't soften the ache. One day, I was commanding a unit under live fire. A week later, I was filling out medical forms and choosing whether I wanted my mail forwarded to the home address or a P.O. box. Ethan was only 10 when I came home. I remember him standing in the doorway, backpack slung too low, hair stuck to his forehead from playing in the yard. He blinked up at me and said, "Are you done being Army?" "Now?" I said. "I think so." He ran off to tell the neighbor kid. I unpacked my duffel in silence. That first year was the hardest. The dreams were constant. Scenes from Helmand, from Kandahar, from cities I can't spell but will never forget. I kept a baseball bat by the bed, not because I expected danger, but because my hands refused to believe they weren't needed anymore. I couldn't work in hospitals. The smell of antiseptic sent me spiraling. I tried volunteering once, at a community clinic, but had to leave midway through when a child coughed blood. Not because I was scared, because my body thought it was back in Sector 4. I began rearranging furniture obsessively. I couldn't sleep with my back to the window, couldn't walk through crowds without mapping exits, couldn't stand the whir of box fans in the summer. They reminded me of the generators we used in the tents. I didn't tell anyone, not my old unit, not the VA counselor I saw exactly once, and certainly not Ethan. Because how do you tell your child that your body is back but your nerves are still overseas? Instead, I learned to breathe through panic. I read cookbooks I never used. I went to bed early, always with the radio low. Just enough static to feel like company. When Ethan asked why I left the Army, I said, my service was complete. He believed me. The years folded like linen. Quiet. Simple. On the outside. But silence isn't nothing. It's a posture. A shield. It became the way I moved through rooms, through motherhood, through birthdays and Christmas mornings, and the slow erosion of recognition. I stopped correcting people when they assumed I'd just been a military nurse. I stopped reminding them that I'd commanded over 60 personnel-coordinated aerial extractions and performed emergency surgeries with nothing but gauze thread and adrenaline. Not because I was ashamed, because I was tired. People love a hero story when it's glossy decorated noble, not when it's wounded twitchy and half silent, so I gave them what they could digest, a quiet woman with a warm smile and a vague past. Someone who brought cookies to the church bake sale and sat politely through Ethan's wedding, even when she was seated near the kitchen. I stopped being Major Whitlow the moment I came home. I became Grace. Just Grace. And if that meant people like Ethan didn't know who I was, well, that was the cost of breathing without breaking. Some people think silence means shame, but for me, it was survival. The invitation came the way most things do now, with formality instead of warmth. Ethan didn't call. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I had plans. He just sent a single-line text on a Thursday night. "Can you come by this weekend? Claire's working." No punctuation. No greeting. Just the functional tone of someone booking a dog sitter. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Of course I would come. I always did. That Saturday morning I got up early, not because I had to, but because I still can't sleep in on weekends. In the Army. Saturday wasn't rest. It was reorganization. Reset. Supply check, first aid kit, inventory, laundry if you were lucky. The body holds on to rhythms long after the orders stop coming. I made lemon bars. Ethan's favorite when he was little. He used to sneak them before dinner, always thinking I didn't notice. I wrapped them carefully in wax paper the way I used to before care packages, and tied the container with twine, even though I knew no one would comment on the effort. I added a soft puzzle book and a small toy truck for Lucas. He liked things with wheels, and things he could line up in rows. That he got from me. The house was a 40-minute drive tucked into one of those new subdivisions where every lawn looks like it's been cut with the same ruler. I parked on the curb. Claire didn't like people using the driveway. And rang the doorbell with my elbow, both hands full. Claire answered in leggings and a towel over her shoulder. Her hair was still damp, eyes preoccupied. "Oh, hi, Grace," she said, already walking back inside. "You're early. Lucas is in the playroom." She didn't ask how I was, didn't offer to take the containers from my arms. Just left the door open behind her. I stepped in. The house always felt too clean. Not clean in the comforting sense. Clean like a showroom. As if real life wasn't supposed to leave a mark. The floors were pale wood, the rugs a soft gray, every surface curated like a magazine page. It smelled like lavender fabric spray and something synthetic I couldn't name. I slipped off my shoes and headed toward the kitchen. Ethan was at the counter, phone in hand, earbuds in. He saw me, but didn't pause his call. He held up a finger, wait, and turned slightly away. I placed the lemon bars on the counter beside him. He didn't even glance at them. I set the small gift for Lucas on the edge of the kitchen table. Next to it was a stack of mail, bills, catalogs, a brightly embossed envelope with gold lettering. My eyes landed on it involuntarily. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the crest on the envelope caught the light. I recognized it. The hospital's insignia. Underneath the words, Employee Recognition Dinner, Invitation Enclosed. Before I could speak, Claire breezed in, drying her hands on a dish towel. She followed my gaze and gave a tight smile. "Oh, that's just something at work next week," she said. "Kind of a little staff thing. You don't need to come. It's mostly for coworkers." She said it lightly, like a joke, like I'd be silly to assume I belonged. I nodded. "Of course, I understand," which is what I always say when people are trying to let me down gently. She turned to Ethan. "Can you watch Lucas for a bit? I need to get to the clinic early." He shook his head. "I've got back-to-backs. Mom can stay, right?" It wasn't a question. "Of course," I said again. Claire disappeared upstairs, and I heard the soft whoosh of the hairdryer start up. Ethan mumbled something about Zoom and disappeared into his office. So there I was, standing alone in their kitchen. I found Lucas in the playroom. He was building a small city out of blocks and toy cars. When he saw me, he squealed with joy. "Grandma, I made a hospital want to be the nurse today?" I smiled. "Only if I get to be in charge." He nodded solemnly. "Okay. You're the boss nurse." That was the only time all day I felt seen. We played for an hour, maybe more. I made funny voices for the patients. He lined up ambulances like a military convoy. I taught him how to triage the block people. Green ones could wait, red needed help right away. Later, I went to the living room for some water. That's when I noticed it, the new photo. Framed and centered above the mantel. Claire in her scrub stethoscope gleaming, Ethan in a crisp dress shirt, Lucas perched on his lap like a magazine ad. Bright, crisp, airbrushed happiness. No trace of me. Not even in the background. I stared longer than I meant to. I had been in the older photo that used to hang there. Back when Lucas was still crawling and I'd held him for half the shoot because he wouldn't sit still. That one was gone now, replaced with a cleaner version of family. I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. The room was too quiet. A distant lawnmower hummed through the window, but inside the silence throbbed. After Claire left, I offered to clean up the kitchen. Ethan nodded without looking up from his laptop. When I brought out the lemon bars, I noticed none had been touched. I opened the container, took one for myself, and sat on the back porch alone. The sun was going down behind the fences, long lines of orange splitting the yard. There was a time when I stood in battlefield tents, giving commands that saved lives. Now I sat on my son's porch, wondering if I should offer to come next weekend or wait until they needed a sitter again. I used to lead under gunfire. Now I ask if I'm welcome at my own son's table. The evening Claire was honored by her hospital, I was home folding toddler socks. It wasn't meant to be a night for me. Claire made that clear in the way she said it. "It's just a staff thing, Grace. Internal, nothing formal." The words were polite, the tone final. The kind of final that makes you feel silly for asking. So I didn't ask. Instead, I arrived early that afternoon, like always. Claire handed me Lucas's routine sheet as if I hadn't cared for the boy dozens of times already. Ethan barely looked up from his email. They were dressed up. Ethan in a slate button-down I hadn't seen before, Claire in fitted navy blue scrubs, with her white coat folded neatly over her arm. Her makeup was subtle but precise, her hair pinned back in that kind of way that says, "Take me seriously." I stood in the foyer holding a plastic container of soup I'd made for later. Chicken barley. No one offered to take it from me. No one asked what was in it. Claire gave Lucas a quick kiss on the forehead and then turned to me. His bedtime's the usual. He's already had a snack. Feel free to put on that Ocean Sounds playlist. Helps him settle. I nodded. Of course. Ethan glanced at his watch. We should go. And then they were out the door. No goodbyes. No thank you. The front door closed and the house exhaled into a silence that felt too practiced. Lucas was in a good mood. We built a small fort out of couch cushions and read 2 books, though he insisted on skipping every 3rd page. I tucked him in by 7:30. He asked if his parents would be back tonight. I said I didn't know. After he fell asleep, I wandered into the kitchen and started tidying up. Not because it was messy, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The kitchen always had this antiseptic perfection to it. Marble counters, white cabinets without a single fingerprint, everything in its place. Except me. I wiped down the sink even though it was already clean. Rearranged the dishwasher even though it was already running. That's when I saw the stack of papers near the dining table. Mail flyers, and a glossy folded pamphlet on top. It caught my eye because I recognized the crest Ridgefield General Hospital embossed in gold. I hesitated, but I was already reaching for it. The front read, Evening of Gratitude, Celebrating Excellence in Care. Claire's face was on the cover, a formal portrait. Arms crossed, half-smile stethoscope like an accessory. She looked confident, polished. The kind of image people use on LinkedIn framed with headlines that say things like Leader in Patient Innovation or Empathy in Action. I opened it. Inside were brief bios for each honoree. Next to Claire's name, a small paragraph. To those who taught me what compassion looks like in action, especially my grandmother who showed me that kindness without recognition is the truest kind. I read it twice. Then again. No name. No mention of me directly. Just my grandmother. It could have been anyone. It could have been someone from a storybook. It could have been fiction. For a moment I told myself it was fine. She didn't mean to exclude me. Maybe she thought she was protecting my privacy. Or maybe it was an editor's decision. But deep down I knew. It was easier for Claire to shape a tribute that felt warm and vague than one that tied her to someone like me. Someone too quiet, too plain, too out of sync with the world they were building. And maybe I'd accepted that long ago. But something about seeing it printed like that in shiny ink with her smiling above it, it ached in a place I didn't know was still tender. I closed the program, folded it neatly, and slid it into the top drawer of the buffet cabinet, the one with the random batteries and old takeout menus. I didn't want it to end up in the trash, but I couldn't keep holding it either. I stood there looking out the kitchen window at a backyard I never helped plant with patio furniture I'd never sat in. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a glow that didn't feel like mine. Around 10:30, Ethan came home. He walked through the door quietly like someone who wasn't sure what he was returning to. His tie was loosened. His eyes were glazed with fatigue. But not exhaustion. It was the look of someone who'd spent the night being acknowledged seen. He stepped into the kitchen, reached for a glass, and filled it from the fridge's water dispenser. I was still by the table, wiping it slowly, methodically. He looked at me, then at the drawer. You saw the program, he asked. I didn't lie. Yes. He took a sip, then sighed. It's Claire's night, he said. Don't make it about you. The words dropped like pebbles, soft but sharp. I hadn't said anything, hadn't commented on the dedication, hadn't questioned my absence from the photo wall or the invitation list. I'd cooked for his child, folded his laundry, kept his home warm in their absence. But somehow my presence alone was an intrusion. I said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call me bitter or dramatic. He just looked away, turned toward the stairs like the conversation, like I was already over. He didn't need to slam a door. See. His silence said enough. And that's what hurt most. Not rejection, not cruelty. Just the casual, effortless way he dismissed me as if I'd never been part of the story to begin with. The call came at 7:43 a.m. Ethan's name flashed across my screen, and before I even answered, I knew what it would be. Lucas's daycare had an emergency inspection, he said, already rushing. Claire's got the morning shift, and I've got a client meeting I can't reschedule. He didn't ask if I was free. He never did. I'll come pick him up, I replied, already pulling on my jeans. Lucas was still in his pajama bottoms when I arrived. His eyes were puffy with sleep, his hair standing in all directions. Claire handed me his coat without a word and kissed the top of his head, already wearing her badge and the expression of someone halfway out the door. He didn't eat much, she said. He's been picky this week. I nodded. I'll take care of him. Ethan handed me a manila folder just as I was zipping Lucas's jacket. Can you drop this off with Claire at the hospital later? She forgot it. Admin forms for a new intake system or something. Of course. By 10, we were parked in the hospital lot, Lucas singing softly to himself in the back seat. I adjusted my collar, checked that his shoes were tied, and walked him through the main entrance. It was the same hospital where I had once briefed military medical staff during a cross-training initiative, years ago in uniform. Now I walked in carrying a dinosaur backpack and a forgotten file. The woman at reception smiled absently and motioned for us to wait. The waiting area was bright and sterile, filled with the soft beeping of devices and the muted coughs of patients and visitors. I sat down with Lucas on my lap and the folder in my bag. After a few minutes, a young nurse passed by. She was maybe 25, with a candy-colored stethoscope looped around her neck and sneakers too clean to have seen much. She stopped in front of us, her eyes resting on Lucas. "Hi there, big guy," she said, crouching to his eye level. Then she looked at me, warm but curious. "Is he here for pediatrics?" "No, just visiting," I replied. She tilted her head. "Are you his nanny?" I smiled, gently, not bitter. "Just family." She apologized quickly, flustered, and continued down the corridor. I didn't mind, not really. She didn't mean anything by it. I've simply learned that when you stop fitting the image people expect, they assume you're hired help. I was tightening Lucas's shoelace when I noticed him. A man, broad-shouldered with a slight limp, wearing a VA hoodie and hospital-issued sweatpants, stood at the hallway entrance, staring at me. He blinked. Then again. His face was fuller now, his beard patchier. But I knew those eyes, wide hazel and always scanning. "Major Whitlow," he said, disbelief cracking through the sterile air. I stood slowly, unsure for a second if I was hallucinating. Then it hit me. "Rodrigo," Far whispered. He moved toward me like gravity had taken over. "Ma'am," he said, almost reverent. "It really is you." He looked at Lucas, then back at me as if trying to reconcile the pieces. "You don't remember me?" "I do," I said. "Afghanistan. Forward Operating Base Vega. Blast injury to your femoral artery. You were 19. He nodded, smiling through something more than surprise. "You saved my life," he said simply. I could feel it then. People watching. One of the nurses had stopped rolling her cart. A man in a business suit paused mid-stride. A woman seated across the lobby lowered her magazine. Rodrigo turned slightly to them, gesturing to me. "She ran our entire field unit," he said. "She coordinated an evac under mortar fire, wrapped my leg with torn-up uniform sleeves because supplies had been bombed. And she didn't flinch. I didn't know what to do with my hands." "I tell people about you," he added softer. "Nobody ever believes the part about the IV line using a ballpoint pen casing." I smiled. "Well, we were short on catheters." He laughed loudly, then turned to a nearby nurse. "You all don't even know who you have in this building today." Just then I felt it, the air shift. The temperature, the mood, like the pressure had changed. Claire. She stepped through the side door with a clipboard in one hand, eyebrows pulled tight. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes darted from Rodrigo to me to Lucas and back to me again. Rodrigo straightened. "This is your mother-in-law?" he asked, still smiling. "She's a legend." Claire's smile was a fraction of its usual self. "Could you?" she said to me, voice just barely controlled. "Could you wait in the car? We're at capacity." I paused. The request wasn't about space, it was about erasure. I felt it in the tremble of her voice, the sharp edge behind her politeness. She wasn't embarrassed by Rodrigo's praise. She was afraid of what it might reveal, of the story it might tell that she hadn't written. I nodded. Of course, no protest, no visible hurt, just obedience. I turned to Rodrigo, offered a quick smile, and took Lucas's hand. "Pancakes?" I asked him gently. He lit up. "With strawberries. With strawberries." As we walked out of the building, I heard whispers behind us. Something about ranks, about recognition, about how someone like me ended up holding someone else's child on a Thursday morning like I had no past. But I didn't turn around. It wasn't the recognition that made my chest ache. It was the look in my son's wife's eyes, the panic, the dismissal, the urgency to erase me all over again. After that day at the hospital, no one mentioned Rodrigo, not Claire, not Ethan, not even a casual offhand, "Oh, I heard someone recognized you." It was as if the moment had been sealed behind glass, too delicate to acknowledge, too inconvenient to touch. I didn't bring it up either. I've learned that when someone tries to erase you, the worst thing you can do is hand them the eraser. But something shifted after that day. Claire grew quieter around me. Not in a cold way, just, calculated. Her words came trimmed, measured, like each one had to pass inspection before it reached my ears. Ethan, too, grew more distant. He texted less, rarely called, and when he did, it was always need-based. No more Sunday visits, no more "Lucas wants to see you." I told myself I was imagining it, that it was work stress, that they were busy. But then came that afternoon. I had come over to drop off a small bag of Lucas's things he'd left at my place. Just a coloring book, a water bottle, and his favorite stuffed giraffe. I let myself in with the spare key like they'd always told me I could. The house was quiet. I assumed no one was home, so I started tidying up the living room, folding the blanket on the couch, stacking a few stray toys. That's when I heard it. Ethan's voice. Low but clear. He was on a call in the office door, half open. "I don't know," he said, exhaling. "It's like she keeps inserting herself lately. She never used to show up like this." My hands froze on the blanket. There was a pause. Then Claire's voice, even softer, from somewhere near him. "She doesn't know when to stop." They weren't yelling. There was no anger in their voices. That's what made it worse. It was casual, offhand, like commentary on the weather, like I was a pattern they were tired of seeing. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I placed the bag by the stairs and walked out as quietly as I could, closing the door behind me with more care than necessary. The drive home felt longer than usual. I kept replaying the words in my head. She keeps inserting herself. She doesn't know when to stop. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was something duller, something heavier. By the time I reached the edge of my neighborhood, I had to pull over. My hands were shaking. My throat felt tight. Not from their words, but from a memory that had risen so suddenly it burned. It was nearly 3 years ago, a farmer's market downtown. I had gone to pick up some honey and blueberries for Lucas. It was crowded that morning. Families, strollers, loud music from a folk band under a white tent, and then someone dropped a tray. A loud, sharp clatter. The metal hit the pavement in a sound too close to a mortar lid. I froze. My vision narrowed. My body locked. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. People kept walking. Someone bumped into me. I heard a voice. A child. No. Claire. She had come with me that day by chance. She was holding Lucas. She saw my face and immediately understood. She set him down, stepped in front of me, gently, took my hands. "You're safe," she'd whispered. "You're not there. Just breathe with me. Here. Now." She had knelt beside me on the hot concrete until the shaking stopped. She never mocked me, never told Ethan. She'd been kind. And now I was inserting myself. Now I was the woman who didn't know when to stop. I merged back onto the road, blinking hard. I've had wounds before. Some healed, jagged, others clean. But this was different. Because it wasn't the battlefield that broke me this time. It was the living room. It was hearing my own son treat my presence like a complication. Like noise, like something to be managed. And Claire. She had once held my hands. Now she didn't even hold my name. Maybe it wasn't just the war that changed me. Maybe being inconvenient to the people you love is its own kind of trauma. When the invitation came, it wasn't really an invitation. It was a group message Ethan sent out with the logistics of Claire's promotion dinner location dress code time. No greeting, no personal note. Just information. The kind that makes you feel included just enough to not complain, but not enough to feel wanted. I stared at it for a few minutes before replying. "I'll be there," I typed. Then deleted the period, then added it back. The restaurant was one of those trendy downtown places that prides itself on minimalist plating and complicated lighting. I arrived early as I always do because being early is a habit I never outgrew from service. There's something about surveying the space before others fill it that lets me breathe easier. The hostess asked for the name, checked her tablet, and led me to a long rectangular table near the back. 12 seats, white tablecloth, silverware already placed in symmetrical rows. No name cards, no reserved sign. She motioned toward the end seat by the service corridor. "This one should be fine," she said. I nodded and sat down. My blazer felt too stiff. I tugged gently at the sleeves, trying to smooth the memory of my hands once being gloved in field dust and adrenaline. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Guests arrived in small clusters. Claire's parents first, then her sister and her fiancé, a few of Claire's co-workers who looked exactly how you'd expect young hospital staff to look: confident, well-groomed, constantly checking their watches like someone important might text at any moment. No one recognized me. Someone asked if I was from hospital admin. I smiled and said, "Just family." The woman nodded politely and turned back to her glass of wine. Ethan and Claire came in last. He had one hand on her back like a guide, the other adjusting his cuff as if he were used to walking into rooms where he was already expected. Claire looked stunning. Green silk dress, light makeup, a diamond-shaped pin that glinted each time she turned her head. They greeted everyone with hugs, smiles, compliments. A few jokes about long shifts and overbooked schedules. Ethan shook hands like a politician. Claire laughed at everything. She didn't look down the table. Didn't acknowledge me. I sipped my water. Dinner began. A waiter with a French accent listed menu items with flair. Most of it I didn't recognize. I chose the lamb because it sounded the simplest. Conversation bubbled easily around me, but never included me. They talked about a ski trip someone was planning, the latest hospital system upgrades. A funny story about a patient who asked if blood came in vegan-friendly. No one asked what I did, or had done. I focused on cutting my lamb, even though it was so tender it barely needed a knife. When the main course ended, Ethan stood. He tapped his fork gently against his champagne glass. Everyone turned. "I just want to say a few words." He began smiling as if he were about to announce a surprise proposal. Claire has always amazed me. With her dedication, her instincts, her ability to care even when she's exhausted. Claire blushed lightly. "She heals with purpose," he said. "And some of us—" He paused, chuckled, then continued. "Just tag along." The room laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Claire laughed too. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan with admiration, not amusement. She liked that line. It had been said before, maybe in private. I didn't laugh. I reached for my water and took a long sip. I had trained field medics under fire. I had once performed a surgical amputation on a dirt floor using nothing but a headlamp, and the kind of calm that only comes from knowing someone's life is in your hands. And now, I was just someone who tagged along. I swallowed hard. Then the restaurant door opened. At first I barely noticed, just another person walking in late. But the air shifted. He was tall, late 30s, uniformed. His posture was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, eyes, alert movements, economical and precise. Combat tested. He scanned the room once, then locked eyes with me. I felt my breath catch. He walked directly to the table, stopping beside me. And then, without hesitation, he saluted. "Major Whitlow, ma'am," he said. Voice steady and clear. "It's been an honor to serve under you." The room froze. Forks hovered. Glasses paused mid-air. The silence was immediate heavy. He continued. "You trained me at Fort Ralston. You taught me how to lead, how to stay calm when the comms go dead and the choices aren't clear. I never forgot that." Claire's mother leaned forward. Major Rodrigo turned to her and nodded. "She commanded a medical logistics unit. She saved lives. She saved mine. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to." He wasn't finished. I just wanted to say it where people could hear, people who might not know. Then he nodded once more, gave me a smile that was more gratitude than greeting, and left as quickly as he'd come. No dramatic music, no applause, just truth, delivered plainly and in full view of everyone who had chosen not to ask. Ethan's mouth was slightly open. Claire looked like she'd been caught mid-breath. Her coworkers avoided eye contact. I picked up my napkin and placed it gently in my lap, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. They had erased me quietly for years. But all it took was one voice, steady and certain, to return my name to the room. No one talked about what happened that night. Not a word. Not after the dinner. Not the next day. Not the next week. There was no text from Ethan. No check-in call. No late night. Sorry if that was awkward. Mom. There was no acknowledgement of the salute of the silence that followed, or the way the air shifted when my name was spoken with respect. Nothing. It wasn't the silence that shocked me. It was how natural it seemed for them. Like the moment had been folded up and put away like seasonal decor they had no use for anymore. I didn't push, I didn't bring it up. But something inside me, something I hadn't even realized, was still holding on, finally let go. And when it did, it wasn't loud. It was still, deliberate, like the quiet breath you take before standing up to leave a room where no one notices you're sitting. So I began the process. The kind of retreat you don't announce. The kind that doesn't leave a slammed door or a shattered plate, just small absences that grow louder with time. First, the bank account. Years ago, I'd opened it in both our names. Ethan had just started his new job. Claire was in her final year of residency, and they were juggling daycare fees and a mortgage they could barely cover. I never made a speech about it. I just deposited a chunk of my savings and told them, if things get tight, this is here. They'd thanked me, of course. Back then, they never touched it after the first year. But I knew they liked knowing it was there. A silent safety net. I went to the bank on a Tuesday. I wore my navy sweater and gray slacks, the same outfit I used to wear to faculty meetings. I didn't make an appointment. I just waited in the chairs sipping lukewarm coffee from the machine in the corner until someone called my name. Closing the joint account, the banker asked, eyebrows raised. I looked at the screen, my name beside Ethan's. Just my part, I said. He can keep his... He asked if I wanted to leave a note on the account. I shook my head. I left the bank feeling nothing. Not proud, not petty, just finished. Next came the insurance. I'd added Claire as a secondary beneficiary on my life policy after Lucas was born. At the time, I told myself it was for him, that if anything happened to me, she could use it for his future. But the truth was, I also wanted her to know I believed in her. That she mattered to me not just as my son's wife, but as a person trying to build a family. I removed her name. The paperwork took less than 15 minutes. The woman processing it asked if something had happened. No, I said, I'm just simplifying. Then I found the spare house key. It was still in the small ceramic bowl near my entryway, wrapped in the same faded ribbon they'd given it to me with when they moved into their house. The ribbon was frayed now, one edge browned from time. I held it in my palm for a long time. Remembered the day they gave it to me. The way Ethan smiled and said, "This means you can come by whenever." I slid it into a padded envelope, wrote their address on the front, no return name, no message. The woman at the post office waited and asked if I wanted tracking. I said no. That weekend, I drove past Lucas's preschool. It was sunny. The playground was full of motion. Tiny limbs climbing, swinging, tumbling over each other like bees in a hive. I parked across the street, rolled down the window, and just watched. Lucas was in a bright blue shirt with a dinosaur on it. He was crouched near the sandbox building, a tower with another child. Every so often he'd laugh. Loud, unfiltered joy that pierced through the glass and into my chest. I could have walked in. Could have signed in at the front desk, tapped on the window, waved. He would have run to me. He always did. But I didn't. Instead, I watched for 5 full minutes, then turned the key in the ignition and drove away. It wasn't about him. Never about him. But I knew. I truly knew. That I had been reduced to something optional. Something convenient. Present when useful, invisible when not. And I was tired of lingering at the edge of their lives, waiting to be rotated in like a spare coat they weren't sure they'd ever need again. So I made the quiet decision to go, not disappear, not punish, just step back, because there's a kind of pain that doesn't scream, the kind that accumulates one oversight at a time until even your existence feels like a misstep. I had once fought in triage tents with no running water under mortar fire while shouting orders into radios that barely worked. I had trained medics who were younger than my son is now. I had been called Major, Ma'am, Commander. And now I was someone who shows up too much. I didn't cry, I didn't rant. I just moved my life back into my own hands, because I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to stop showing up where I was only ever tolerated. It started like so many other Tuesdays. Quiet, gray, unremarkable. The kind of day that makes you feel invisible before it even starts. I was folding laundry in my small living room, watching a rerun of some home renovation show I never finished. The towels were warm, fresh from the dryer. Familiar, soft. Then came the knock. Not a friendly one. Not hesitant. Just 3 hard, rhythmic taps. Like someone knocking because they had the right, not because they were asking. I opened the door and found Ethan standing there, coat still on folder in hand. He didn't smile, didn't ask if it was a good time. He just stepped inside like he still knew the layout of my life. "Hi," he said, glancing around. "You haven't changed much in here." I didn't respond to that. I just nodded toward the couch. He didn't sit. Instead, he held out the folder. "This is the updated mortgage plan," he said, matter of fact. "Rates are up. We're refinancing." I took the folder, though I didn't open it. "Claire and I were going over everything," he continued, "and realized you haven't contributed this quarter. Normally you handle the home insurance, at least that part." It wasn't accusatory. It was casual, like I was a service that had missed a payment cycle. I set the folder on the coffee table gently. "I closed that account," I said. He blinked. "Which one?" "The joint one. The one you and I opened years ago." A pause. Then why I folded the last towel before answering. Because I finally understood what it meant to pay for something and still not be welcome. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh, not quite contempt. "Mom, come on." "No," I said. "You come on. You came into my home without asking. You handed me a bill without a word of thanks. You treat my help like it's a line item. Expected, but unspoken." His jaw shifted. "You used to be dependable," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Now you just fade. Fade." That one word hit like a switchblade. Quick, sharp, silent. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just walked into the hallway, opened the top of the linen closet, and pulled out a cedar box I hadn't touched in years. It was light, but it carried weight. I returned to the living room, set it on the table, and opened it with care. Inside a laminated bronze star citation. A creased letter from the Secretary of Defense. A unit photo from 1993 taken in the middle of a forward operating base. In it, I'm crouched beside a wounded corporal, hand bracing his shoulder. My own uniform streaked in sand and blood. We were both smiling. Barely. But it was real. I didn't say anything. I just slid the box toward him. He hesitated, then leaned over and looked. I watched his face. It didn't show surprise. Just confusion. Like he was reading about someone he didn't fully believe existed. "I've never seen these," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "You kept them." "I didn't know if I should," I said, "but I figured if no one else would remember, I had to." He picked up the citation, read the first few lines, then set it down like it burned. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "No," I answered, "you didn't. You also never asked who I was before I was your mother." He said nothing. So I kept going quietly. "You see an old woman with laundry and a pension. But before that, I made decisions that kept people alive. I led under fire. I stitched wounds in the dark. I once operated for 6 straight hours without food or water. And when I came home, I didn't need parades or medals. I just wanted to be included." He looked down. "And instead you handed me bills," I added, "and called it love." Ethan sank onto the edge of the couch. He looked smaller than usual. Or maybe I was just standing taller now. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said finally. I nodded, "But you did." We sat in silence for a long moment. The TV still played in the background, a woman on screen talking about backsplash tiles and kitchen lighting. The contrast felt absurd. He started. "Claire and I have a lot going on. We never meant for you to feel like I was an obligation," I finished. He rubbed his forehead. "It's not that simple." "It never is," I agreed. I stood up and gently closed the box. Returned it to the closet without ceremony. When I came back, Ethan was already gathering his coat. "I should get going," he said. I walked him to the door. As he stepped out, I paused. "You once asked me why I never told you what I did in the military," I said. He turned surprised. "I didn't tell you," I continued, "because I didn't think you'd care. And in the end, I was right." He swallowed hard. "I do care." I looked him in the eye. "I don't need you to be proud. I just need you to remember who I was, before you decided I was no longer useful." He didn't reply. He just nodded, stepped outside, and walked down the hall without looking back. The door clicked shut behind him. And in the quiet that followed, I didn't feel broken. I felt intact, not because he saw me, but because, for the first time in a long time, I saw myself again. I never did go back to Ethan's house after that last conversation. There were no phone calls, no messages, no attempts to smooth things over with a lukewarm, "Let's put this behind us." And honestly, I was grateful for the silence. It gave me space to hear myself again. For the first time in years, without someone else's disappointment drowning me out. The days turned cooler. Autumn was settling in for good. I started waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but choice. I liked the way the light crept across my kitchen tiles in the morning. I liked how quiet the street was at that hour. Just birds and wind and the occasional dog walker in a hoodie too big for their frame. I began volunteering at the Veterans Rehab Center 3 miles from my apartment. I'd passed it hundreds of times before, usually on my way to the grocery store or the pharmacy. It sat low to the ground, built more for utility than beauty, with tired flags flapping from aluminum poles. The first time I stepped inside, I almost turned around. The smell of antiseptic, the institutional lighting, the sharp edge of memories I had trained myself to blunt. But the receptionist smiled and asked, "You here to volunteer?" And I nodded, before I could talk myself out of it. They had me start slow, stocking medical carts, organizing records, changing out water pitchers, things that didn't require credentials but benefited from instinct. I never mentioned my rank, never corrected the nurses when they assumed I was just Miss Grace from around the block. I liked it that way. The quiet work, the nods of appreciation, the way some of the older vets would lift their chins at me, wordless but present. It felt clean, real. About 3 weeks in, I was working with intake files in the back storage room, trying to alphabetize a stack of misplaced folders. My fingers paused over a familiar unit designation. Forward Med Group 56. Fallujah rotation. I blinked. The file wasn't mine, but the names inside were like echoes. Johnson, Vega, Kaminsky, men I hadn't spoken of in a decade, but whose faces I still saw in dreams. Just then, a young man walked by. Mid-20s, lean with a slight limp that didn't seem to slow him down. His name tag said Jordan. He glanced at the folder, then at me. "Ma'am," he said cautiously. "Were you Major Whitlow?" I hadn't heard that name spoken in years. I froze. He didn't say it like a guess. He said it like someone reaching for a hand in the dark and being certain they found it. "Yes," I managed. My throat was suddenly dry. His face broke into something close to awe. "My uncle, Nate Mendoza, served under you. He used to tell us about the time you saved his convoy during a blackout. Said you had more guts than anyone in the region. I didn't know what to say." So I smiled. "That was a long time ago," I offered. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Some stories stick." Then he nodded once and walked away. I stood there in the records room for a full minute, hand still resting on that folder, my chest tight in a way that didn't hurt, but didn't quite release either. That afternoon, when I returned to the front desk to drop off supply logs, something was waiting under the clipboard. A folded piece of paper. Handwritten. No signature. "Your story makes me believe I can heal too." I didn't know if it was from Jordan, or someone who overheard, or someone who just knew. But I held it in my palm like it was made of something breakable. Not because it was fragile, but because I took it home, slipped it into the cedar box right beside the photo of the medic tent and the citation Ethan hadn't wanted to read. That night, for the first time in years, I slept through without waking at 3 a.m. from the phantom sounds of helicopters. The next morning, something else arrived. A drawing, folded into an envelope with no return address. The paper was thick and ridged, the kind they use in preschool art time. Crayon scribbles covered the whole page. A smiling woman with round glasses and gray hair holding hands with a little boy next to what might have been a tree. Or a sun. Hard to say. Kids draw feelings, not details. But I knew that crooked little smile. And I knew the lopsided boots. It was Lucas's. No name. No note. Just color and space. I pressed it against my fridge with a magnet shaped like a duck, the kind he used to play with in the tub. I stood back and looked at it, let my eyes soften. It didn't fix everything. It wasn't a bridge, but it was a crack of light in a door I'd stopped knocking on. Some days that picture was the only thing I spoke to. I'd pass by the fridge and say, "Nice boots today, soldier," or "That sun's looking extra bright." Other days I said nothing at all. Just looked. I never heard from Ethan. He never followed up, never explained. And maybe he never would. But I realized something on one of those early mornings. Coffee in hand, silence thick around me, that drawing on the fridge. I didn't need him to rewrite the past. I just needed to stop letting him erase it. At the rehab center, they still call me Grace. And that's fine. But every now and then, someone new arrives, looks at me a little longer, tilts their head and says, "You seem like you've seen things." And I nod. Because I have. And I stayed. Some names get forgotten. Some get erased. But some, just a few, get carried forward by the people who needed them most. And this time, mine stayed. If Grace's journey reminded you of your own quiet strength, your own silent sacrifices, I hope this story helped you feel seen. You are not invisible. And you never were. So many women carry the weight of being overlooked by the very people they once protected, provided for, or quietly stood behind. But silence isn't surrender, and dignity doesn't always need to raise its voice. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. And in the comments, tell us, what part of your story do you wish someone had honored before you go? Make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next story. Because the quietest truths are often the ones that matter most. Until next time, stand tall, in your truth, your grace, and your name.